integral is all quadrants, levels, line states, and types. It's the minimum series of perspectives that Ken Wilber could come up with to have the most full understanding of the moment. And it's a meta theory that self-organizes other theories. And what's beautiful about it is that when you are at that altitude and enacting it, you naturally form your own cosmology. That's an integrally informed cosmology. Not exactly like any other, but fitting well with all of them. And I've been more and more fascinated with that over the last 4 or 5 years. So in these integral altitude psychotherapies, what do they have in common? Well, there's a series of understandings. The people might not articulate them the way I'm articulating them, but these are understandings that are embodied in these people that are at integral altitude psychotherapies. And one of them is that life is processes. I mean, absolute truth is pure, unchanging conscious. Everything else is, the feminine, the masculine, feminine. Everything else is movement. Life is processes. Processes that surround us in multiple, countless contexts. And we can affect those processes. We don't have 100% power over any one process at all. We don't have zero. Somewhere in between. And a lot of the stuff that has to do with us that we can affect. And what health is we're optimally affecting the processes of our life. We're affecting them so that they're working as good and better. And we're oriented around that. And that's a healthy person. If you think about it, if there's any aspect of your life that's not working, it's because the processes there are not delivering. They're not being dealt with optimally. And so if we send our attention into them and start changing them for the better, we become healthier. Just like in my 5-star thing, the second star is someone take care of the physical and psychological health. This is basically attending to these processes. Another thing that all the systems have in common, the teal altitude systems, is that to grow, we need productive self-awareness.
Right.
Okay, not just self-awareness. Self-awareness without action actually is a defense.
Right.
If I use insight to avoid doing something that I need to do, basically I'm using it as a psychological defense to avoid change. Productive self-awareness is that stuff that I learn or insights that I have or something like that changes me in some fashion. I receive influence and allow myself to be changed. And also, all the systems have an understanding of what the self is. I was listening to Bina Sharma on Roger and John's Deep Transformation podcast, which is just a lot of fun. And Bina said all living things have an orientation reflex. And what the self is in the human being is that that orientation reflex basically raised to its highest level of complexity in the known universe. You and I orienting to each other, Keith, my sense of Keith and your sense of Corey, orienting to each other in this moment is the most complex orienting impulse in the known universe right now. So that's the self. And that self, aware of us moving through the world and relating and observing ourselves and then seeing what works and doesn't and adjusting. All the systems have a sense of that. Also, whether they know it or not, integral altitude therapists see everybody as having multiple states, being particular types of people, operating at different stages of development, constantly shifting, with one set of productive habits or patterns or whatever, and then non-productive, mostly defensive habits or patterns. In other words, an intuitive understanding of quadrants, levels, line states, and types. Similarly, people that operate at teal altitude have a relationship with spirit. Now, for me, this is very explicit. I was working with, I was doing an intervention session with an alcoholic last week. And you know, in AA, the 12 steps, which basically downloaded by Bill Wilson, ultimately inspired by Carl Jung, interestingly. Carl Jung told one guy he couldn't help him have a spiritual renewal, who told another guy, Carl Jung couldn't help me, but I had a spiritual renewal, told another guy the same thing, who was Bill Wilson, and started AA. You need a connection with a higher power. And so when he and I were talking about it, I was connected to the other world. I said, you know, I feel the other world coming through me. This isn't just Keith. And I could feel it. It really helped me at that moment with him. And most integral altitude therapists can do that. They have that stable connection. And along those lines, integral altitude therapists know that everything is relationships with ourselves, our past, present, and future, different states that we have. You know, each state has a different self associated with it. Now, ultimately, as we develop a wise self, there's a wise self kind of overseeing the shifts. You know, so it's like Keith observing Keith happy, Keith observing Keith frightened, Keith observing Keith joyful, Keith observing Keith ashamed. There's a hierarchy of selves. The wise self is kind of there, very similar to A.H. Chalmers's, Hamid Ali's concept of soul, actually. That everything's relationships, and you can put love into any relationship. Now, psychotherapy is organized around putting love into relationships. And integral attitude therapists, if you say, well, where's the relationship that you can't put love into? We'll say there isn't one. They won't know that they have that value until you ask them that. But that will be the answer. That's the answer that comes out of an integral altitude psychotherapy. And in that altitude, since you can put love into every relationship, there's a felt appreciation for multiple systems. You know, I mentioned numerous times back with you that when I was coming up, one of the ways that systems identify themselves is by trashing the other systems.
Right.
So one thing that I just hated about them, I had to go, so we're going to have to go through this now, you know? So
right.
So I have to listen to the de rigueur, you know, like Gestalt badmouth the behaviors, the behaviors badmouth the psychosynthesis, and blah, 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 badmouth. So I got sick of all that. But I love their systems, you know? And after a while, when I had a little more credibility, I started challenging people. Like, hey, look, let's just see how they all fit together. Until attitude, they all fit together.
I actually created, Keith, in preparation for this, I do what I often do, and created a context map that basically tries to identify the major schools of psychology and then how they end up getting situated into the four quadrants, which is, when you look at it as a whole, you know, it's comprehensive but not complete, right? There's any number of other schools that we could add to the graphic and all that. But when you look at it sort of as a whole and you see just how many different entrance points there are into sort of our psychological condition, it's staggering. And it blows you away just how much granularity of expertise exists in the world, where some of these approaches are going to be more or less appropriate for certain problems in certain individuals at certain times in their lives. Just having this full arsenal of tools at our disposal, particularly for an integral psychotherapist who see all these schools as being, you know, partially true and helpful for you know, this situation or that situation. It's powerful. It is an incredible set of tools that are now available to us here in the 21st century that never really existed before.
Hey, include that in the show notes, okay?
Sure.
And also, just along those lines, you know, you can only enact one thing at a time. So, to a certain extent, you're always limited by the system that you're enacting, whatever that system is, which is fine. And there's a lot of reasons about taking certain systems to, like if I want to deal with subcortical areas, I use EMDR and brain spotting, for instance, because, you can't get there conceptually. The whole concept of an inner child is just that's been a useful concept starting like in the 60s. And then pretty much everybody who comes up with some way of dealing with it, kind of says, well, now this is my new idea about how to do this. Internal family systems is another good example of that. Whatever you're doing, you're emphasizing that, not emphasizing something else.
Mm-hmm.
And so one thing about integral altitude psychotherapies is that there's a tremendous faith in your unconscious participation wholeheartedly in the work.